The first time my stepfather tried to break my engagement, he didn't scream, threaten, or slam a door. He sent a 20-year-old girl to do it for him. It was a Tuesday night, quiet, ordinary, the kind of night where my fiance and I were supposed to be talking about cake flavors and guest lists. Instead, my phone lit up with a Facebook message request from someone I didn't know, Amy Thompson. Her message was short, polished, and cruel in the way lies always are when they're rehearsed. I need to tell you something about your fiance. She's been messaging me on dating apps. We met up twice. She told me she was single. I remember the way the room seemed to tilt, just slightly, like the world wanted to see whether I'd fall. My fiance, Julian, was sitting across from me at the kitchen counter, barefoot, sleeves rolled up, looking tired in that gentle way that used to make me feel safe. He comes from old money, the kind that buys silence and clean reputations, but he never used it like a weapon. He drove an older car, wore simple clothes, and insisted on splitting bills when we were still dating. I showed him the message without thinking. That's the kind of couple we are. No hidden passwords, no secret corners. Julian read it once, then looked up, steady, calm, almost insulted on my behalf. She's lying, he said. Not a question, a fact. But lies don't need to be true to do damage. So we called Amy on speaker. At first, she performed the story like she'd memorized it in front of a mirror. Dates, places, a restaurant downtown, her apartment. Details that sounded almost real, almost convincing, almost designed to make your stomach turn. Then Julian asked for proof. Screenshots, photos, anything. There was a pause, a tiny crack in her voice. And in that crack, everything spilled out. I'm sorry, she whispered. Someone told me to say it. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. Who? She hesitated, like saying the name would summon him into the room. Then she said it anyway. Mark, my stepfather. The man who raised me since I was 12. The man married to my mother. The man who had been telling me for 2 years that Julian was too good for me, that I was dragging him down, that I should be grateful anyone like him even looked my way. And suddenly the lie wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Amy admitted next, through tears, through shame. Mark hadn't just used her as a messenger. He'd been sleeping with her for months, and he'd promised to leave my mother if Amy helped him destroy my future first. My name is Jessica Hale. I'm 26, and on paper my life looks like something people would envy. A research assistant at a university lab, a fiancé who loves me with a kind of patience most people only pretend to have, and a family name that opens doors without anyone needing to knock. But the truth is, money doesn't protect you from the people who want to own you. It just gives them better tools. I met Julian Mercer 2 years ago in a coffee shop near campus. I was late, classic me, hair still damp from a rushed shower, tote bag digging into my shoulder, laptop bouncing against my hip like it was judging my life choices. I was weaving between tables when my elbow clipped someone's cup. Coffee splashed. A sharp breath. A pause that felt like a courtroom silence. I turned and saw him. Calm, startled, but not angry. He looked down at his shirt, then back up at me, with these steady eyes that made me feel less stupid than I deserved. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, I blurted, already reaching for napkins. He laughed, softly, like it genuinely didn't matter. It's okay. I think the coffee lost the fight more than I did. I bought him a replacement. We started talking. It was that simple. No fireworks, no dramatic fate moment. Just two people who kept finding reasons to not end the conversation. Julian worked in IT support then. Steady job, decent benefits, the kind of career that doesn't sound glamorous but pays the rent and shows up when it matters. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't trying to impress me. And after growing up around people who always had an angle, that felt like oxygen. For the first 6 months, I didn't tell him about my family's wealth. Not because I wanted to trick him, but because I'd watched money change the way people looked at me. Like I was a prize. Like I came with a vault. Like affection was something you invested in and expected returns from. So I hid it the way I'd trained myself to. Older car, simple clothes, splitting bills, keeping my last name quiet. When I finally told him, it was on a night we were eating cheap takeout on my couch. My heart was pounding like I was confessing a crime. He listened. He didn't blink. He didn't ask what I could do for him. He just said, "Thank you for trusting me." And that's when I knew this wasn't a game to him. Meeting my mother was easy. Linda Hale, 51, polished but warm in a controlled way. The kind of woman who could smile while evaluating you like she was reading the fine print of your soul. She asked Julian about his job, his family, his plans, and he answered honestly, not defensively, not trying to charm her. But Mark made his opinion clear the first night. He'd married my mother when I was 12, after my biological father died in a car accident. I still remember the way the house sounded after the funeral. Too quiet, like even the walls were afraid to speak. Mark arrived in our lives like a solution, a man with confidence, connections, and a voice that could fill any room. He'd come from a middle-class background, but after marrying into my mother's world, he built a consulting business that fed on relationships and appearances. He always told people he raised me like his own. What he meant was he believed that gave him rights. After that first dinner, he pulled Julian aside. I saw it from across the room. Mark's hand on Julian's shoulder, the way he leaned in like a mentor. Julian's polite smile, the tightness around his eyes. Later, Julian told me what Mark said. He told Julian to think seriously about whether he was the right fit for me. He said I needed someone who could match my social status, someone who could provide the lifestyle I was accustomed to. And then came the phrase I still hate, don't hold her back. From that moment on, Mark treated my relationship like a problem to solve. At every family event, he planted little comments like nails. He brought up better men, better connections, better opportunities. He framed it as concern, but it always felt like control. The worst was last Christmas. Mark invited us to a charity gala. Didn't tell us he'd also invited Trevor Lang, a 28-year-old lawyer from a prominent family. Mark spent the whole evening orbiting me toward Trevor like I was a business deal about to close. When I refused, Mark's smile didn't break, but his eyes did something colder. And I remember thinking, standing under all those lights and champagne flutes, if he could do this in public, smiling, what would he be capable of in private? After the engagement, the pressure didn't explode. It condensed, like a storm tightening itself above our heads, waiting for the right moment to break. Julian proposed 3 months ago, quietly, thoughtfully, the way he does everything. No flash mob, no audience. Just a ring he'd chosen himself and a question he asked like he already knew the answer, but wanted to hear me say it anyway. I said yes without hesitation. Mark didn't clap, didn't smile, didn't even fake enthusiasm. He arrived late to the small family celebration we'd planned and stayed just long enough to poison the air. While everyone else was talking about venues and dates, he cornered me in the kitchen, his voice low, controlled, the way he uses it when he thinks he's being reasonable. "You're making a mistake," he said. I told him this wasn't up for debate. He laughed, not cruelly, worse, dismissively. "You'll come to your senses." That was the moment I stopped trying to win him over. I limited contact after that. I still saw my mother. I still showed up for holidays. But the second Mark started in on his comments, Julian and I would leave. Mark hated that. You could see it in the way he watched us, like he was losing leverage. 6 weeks passed. No major incidents. Just the usual passive-aggressive remarks delivered with a smile. Julian stayed calm. I stayed tired. And then, Amy. When she confessed that Mark had put her up to the lie, my first instinct wasn't rage. It was nausea. Because suddenly everything lined up. The control, the entitlement, the way Mark spoke about my life like it was a business plan he'd invested in. Amy didn't sound like a mastermind. She sounded young, scared, desperate to please someone who had promised her the world. She told us Mark had been flirting with her for months at the restaurant where she worked. Business lunches, lingering conversations, compliments that escalated into invitations. She said he told her she was mature for her age, that she understood him in ways my mother never did. I felt sick hearing that. When Amy sent the photos, him in hotel lobbies, at restaurants I recognized from his social media posts, my hands started shaking. The timestamps went back months, long before our engagement, long before the fake cheating message. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. Julian sat beside me in silence as I scrolled through the evidence. I could feel his anger like heat, but he didn't interrupt. He didn't push. Finally, he said softly, "Your mom deserves to know." I knew that, but knowing something and doing it are two different kinds of pain. My mother had been married to Mark for 14 years. She trusted him, defended him, let him handle finances, social connections, decisions that shaped her life. If I told her, everything would shatter. If I didn't, Mark would keep going. And the part that scared me most? Mark didn't see what he'd done as wrong. Amy told us he framed it as protection. He said he was saving me from a bad marriage, saving me from settling, saving me from a man he didn't approve of. As if my happiness was a project he had authority over. As if my engagement was something he could sabotage without consequence. That night, Julian asked me what I wanted to do. I told him the truth. I was afraid. Afraid of hurting my mother. Afraid of Mark's reaction. Afraid that confronting him would make things worse. That he'd turn this into another war, another manipulation. Julian didn't push. He just said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." That's when I realized the contrast was impossible to ignore. One man wanted to control my life. The other was willing to stand beside me while I chose it for myself. And I knew this wasn't going to end quietly. It all came crashing down 3 days after we discovered Amy's messages. I still remember the moment like it's etched into my bones. Julian and I had been poring over the evidence, printing copies, organizing screenshots, photos, text messages, everything. My hands were sticky from coffee, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every time I thought I'd seen the worst, another image appeared. Mark whispering into Amy's ear at a restaurant, holding her hand, smiling in a way that was supposed to be private. We had decided that I needed to confront him first, before my mother. Julian stayed calm, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He knew how explosive this could get. We met him at a downtown coffee shop, neutral territory, safe from witnesses, yet public enough that he wouldn't act too violently. My stomach felt hollow as I approached the table. Mark was already there, pretending to read the menu, tapping his pen against the cup. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and tension. I took a deep breath, sliding into the seat across from him. I placed the printed evidence on the table, letting it fan out in front of him like cards in a hand he didn't know how to play. "I know about Amy," I said, voice steady but tight. "I know about the affair, and I know you tried to destroy my engagement through her." His eyes went wide. For the first time in years, I saw him startled. Not smug, not controlling, stunned. And for a second, I felt a flicker of power. Then he recovered. "It's not what you think," he said smoothly, brushing a strand of graying hair from his forehead. "It's over. She's obsessed with me. You're misunderstanding." I raised an eyebrow, pushing a photo toward him. One of Amy and Mark at a hotel. Time-stamped, geotagged, unmistakable. Mark's face went pale. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His fingers tapped the table nervously. That tiny tremor in his hands. It had never existed before. "Explain this," I said. My voice was calm, but the underlying rage vibrated through every word. He stammered, gave some half-baked story about Amy being misled, that he hadn't instructed her to lie. My chest tightened, a mix of disgust, disbelief, and fury. I realized I could feel my body preparing for a storm, muscles taut, hands clenching, heart hammering like a warning drum. Every instinct screamed danger, betrayal, and the need for action. I called Amy on speaker, right there, and asked her to repeat everything she had told us. The moment her voice came through, trembling, apologetic, confirming Mark's instructions, I felt a cold wave pass over me. Julian's hand on mine steadied the trembling I hadn't realized had started. Amy detailed the months of manipulation, how Mark had coached her, given her false information about me, and promised her rewards for playing his part. The moral decay was complete, the scheme meticulous. Mark went white, his defenses crumbled. He tried to interrupt, denied, protested. Julian, calm as ever, simply held my gaze, letting him fail publicly. Then Amy said it. Mark planned this. He had intended to sabotage my engagement to Julian, manipulating both of us. He'd used a vulnerable girl as his pawn. He had lied, cheated, and exploited trust for months, all to satisfy his own ego. And the final blow? He didn't see a wrong in any of it. In his mind, he was the victim. The family was endangered. I was being protected. My happiness? Irrelevant. Julian's presence in my life? Irrelevant. Only his control mattered. The room felt like it shrank. I could hear my own heartbeat, each pulse a reminder of the violation. My hands were cold, my throat tight, but my voice held. I looked at Julian, and he nodded, steady and sure. I realized in that moment that we were the only ones with a chance to stop him. I sat back, took a deep breath. The shock was still there, but beneath it, a spark of clarity. Mark could not win, not anymore. The confrontation didn't end in screaming, though I wanted to. It ended in silence. Mark knew the evidence was irrefutable. Amy's voice had done what I couldn't have done alone, expose him entirely. And I knew this was just the beginning. Once my mother found out, there would be no going back. The fragile facade of control he had built over the past 14 years was about to collapse. I felt nauseous, trembling, but also powerful. For the first time in months, I understood the full weight of my agency in this story. The manipulation, the lies, the betrayal. It ended now because I refused to let him continue. As we left the coffee shop, Julian squeezed my hand. We didn't speak. Words weren't necessary. We were aligned, focused, and, for the first time since this nightmare began, ready. After that coffee shop confrontation, Julian and I returned home in a silence so heavy it felt like it could crush us. The city hummed around us, oblivious, indifferent, while inside my mind raced with fragments of what I had just learned. Mark, the man who had stood in my life like an immovable pillar, was a liar, a manipulator, and a predator. And yet he still commanded some inexplicable hold over my mother, over family perception, over the air I breathed in this house. I walked into our apartment and leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping the edge like it was the only stable thing in the room. My hands shook. My chest was tight. My mind replayed Amy's trembling voice over and over, the details of Mark's manipulation tattooed onto my memory. Every moment he had planned, every whispered instruction to Amy, every lie he told about me, it was all there, undeniable. Julian sat across from me, calm but tense, reading the same emails and messages, taking in the photos, the timestamps, the places. I felt an intense mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, horror, and an almost paralyzing grief. Not for myself, though I felt violated, but for my mother. For Amy, who had been used as a pawn. For the version of me that had ever believed in Mark as a protector, as a figure of guidance. He had stolen the reality I thought I lived in and replaced it with something dark, strategic, and utterly selfish. I wondered for the first time how much of my family's history had been real and how much had been carefully curated by a man who believed himself untouchable. Julian placed his hand over mine, grounding me, and I realized I needed to process the truth before doing anything else. I needed to understand the full extent of his betrayal before approaching my mother, before confronting him again, before taking any action. I sat down at my desk and wrote everything out, every message, every photo, every detail Amy had confirmed. I cataloged it chronologically, meticulously, so that no one could dismiss it. Each sentence I typed was a release of tension and a sharpening of focus. My body remained taut, but my mind became precise. Writing it down made it feel real and actionable. It shifted me from a passive observer to someone preparing for a response, for justice, for confrontation. Yet, even as I documented, I wrestled with guilt. How much of this should I tell my mother? How do you reveal that the man you trusted with your entire adult life, your marriage, and your household had been deceiving you for years? Would she blame me for shattering the world she had built around him? I shivered at the thought, but I knew I could not allow her to remain in the dark any longer. It was not just about Julian and me. It was about truth, about safety, about the consequences of Mark's manipulation. He had already shown he would go to extreme lengths to control and sabotage, and silence was complicity. As the hours ticked by, I felt anger settle into a cold, strategic resolve. I remembered every moment Mark had tried to isolate me, to undermine Julian, to shape perceptions in his favor. Every casual smile, every advice, disguised as concern, every calculated word, everything. And I realized I would not be silent. I would not allow fear to dictate my actions. This was no longer about family politeness or avoiding discomfort. It was about reclaiming autonomy and protecting those I loved. Julian, ever patient, reminded me that we were in this together. He didn't speak loudly or gesticulate. He simply mirrored my focus. His calmness gave me strength. He said softly, "Whatever you need to do, I'm with you. We'll navigate this carefully, but we can't ignore it." And I knew he was right. Ignoring it had allowed Mark to manipulate events for years. Confronting it directly would be uncomfortable, painful, and possibly explosive, but necessary. For the first time, I felt like we had control, not him. For the first time, I realized that while Mark had attempted to orchestrate our lives, he had underestimated the combination of evidence, courage, and resolve that Julian and I could wield together. As I closed my laptop, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and empowerment. The shock had subsided into clarity. My mind, though still racing, began to plan the steps forward. Confront my mother with the evidence, secure protection against further manipulation, and ensure that Mark's schemes would have consequences. But I also allowed myself a brief, private acknowledgement. Fear had been a constant companion, but anger and resolve were now stronger. The reaction I had feared, the unraveling of family harmony, the confrontation, the emotional storm, was inevitable. And yet, I no longer felt powerless. I felt ready. I took a deep breath, feeling my hands unclench and my chest slowly expand. The storm had been seeded, yes, but now I had a plan for how it would break. And for the first time since discovering Mark's betrayal, I felt a flicker of confidence that we would survive the coming chaos. The days after the confrontation were nothing short of chaotic. Mark, predictably, did not take the exposure quietly. Even without knowing what I would say to my mother, he began testing boundaries, calling, texting, trying to manipulate those around us. Amy, the girl he had used as his pawn, became increasingly desperate, showing up at Jessica's workplace and sending repeated messages. Each contact reminded me of how deep Mark's reach had been, how meticulously he had tried to control not just my life, but everyone connected to me. Julian and I spent hours reviewing security measures, changing passwords, and documenting every interaction. It was exhausting, but necessary. At night, I lay awake, replaying each conversation, each smirk, each sly comment Mark had made over the years. It all lined up into a pattern of control and manipulation that I could no longer ignore. The family intervention came sooner than I expected. My mother, Linda, though initially skeptical, began noticing discrepancies, strange messages from Amy, vague explanations from Mark, and subtle inconsistencies in his stories. She reached out cautiously, unsure if she could trust her instincts after 14 years of marriage. Julian and I had prepared, but the tension in the room was palpable the moment we arrived. Mark, predictably, tried to assert control immediately. He dismissed concerns, shifted blame, and even attempted to charm his way through the room, smiling in a way meant to disarm. But the evidence was undeniable. Photos, timestamps, screenshots, and Amy's first-hand account left no room for his manipulation. Linda's hands trembled as she examined the printed copies, disbelief etched into her features. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The weight of years of deception pressed on the room like a tangible force. Then the confrontation escalated. Mark, cornered and furious, shifted from charm to aggression. He accused Julian of turning me against him, of interfering in family matters I had no right to touch. He raised his voice, gestured wildly, and for the first time I saw cracks in his carefully constructed persona. The man who had orchestrated months of lies was suddenly reactive, exposed, human. His fury was palpable, a mix of fear and anger that revealed just how much control he had relied on. My mother intervened, but Mark ignored her pleas. Julian, calm yet assertive, stepped forward, grounding the conversation in facts. He detailed the timeline of my engagement, the messages, the photos, and Amy's testimony. He spoke without anger, yet every word carried the weight of truth. Mark could no longer deflect. Each claim he made was immediately countered with evidence. The cycle of lies he had built for years began to crumble, brick by brick. Amid the chaos, Amy remained a witness, albeit a terrified one. She recounted the manipulations, the instructions, the promises Mark had made to her. Her voice, shaky but clear, confirmed everything. I watched Mark's face as her words landed, red, pale, incredulous, desperate. His attempts to charm or control the room failed. Each lie he tried to weave unraveled in real time, exposing the depth of his deceit. The intensity of the confrontation was compounded by other family members. My aunt, Jessica's extended family, and Mark's business associates became aware of the situation, either present or notified later. They started questioning him, doubting his narratives, and expressing concern. The web of accountability widened. He was no longer acting in private. His actions had spilled into every corner of his life. By the end of the day, Mark had lost almost all semblance of authority. The room, once dominated by his presence, now shifted toward a collective assertion of truth and protection. Linda, though shocked and grieving, began reclaiming her autonomy. Julian and I emerged as steadfast allies, our bond strengthened through the shared ordeal. Amy, too, started to see the consequences of her role, gaining courage from the support around her. But the escalation wasn't just emotional, it became legal and logistical. Mark's harassment continued, calls, texts, appearing near our apartment, but Julian and I documented everything meticulously. Protective orders were filed. Lawyers became involved. Amy's erratic behavior, fueled by Mark's manipulations, required intervention. Every layer of escalation revealed the calculated nature of Mark's interference and the urgent need for boundaries, accountability, and consequences. Throughout, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Each confrontation, each legal step, each conversation with Julian and my mother reinforced the reality. Mark's control could no longer be tolerated. The emotional strain was immense, but so was the clarity. We were no longer passive participants. The battle lines were drawn, not with aggression, but with evidence, truth, and resolve. I could see now that exposing Mark, protecting Julian, protecting my mother, and reclaiming autonomy wasn't just necessary, it was the only path to safety, sanity, and eventual healing. The escalation of events reached a tipping point that made it clear. There was no turning back. Mark had revealed his true nature through his actions, and every witness, every piece of evidence, and every intervention tightened the circle of accountability. Julian and I stood united. My mother began to reclaim her agency, and Amy, though initially a pawn, began to see the consequences of complicity. The stakes had never been higher, and the fallout of Mark's actions was only beginning to unfold. After the crescendo of confrontations, a heavy silence settled over the house in my mind. The storm outside mirrored what I felt internally, an exhausting, suffocating fog of betrayal, disbelief, and helplessness. I remember sitting in my bedroom, alone, the walls suddenly feeling like they were closing in, each shadow whispering the words I could barely admit to myself. How did I not see this coming? How could someone I trusted so completely orchestrate such calculated destruction? Julian tried to comfort me, but even his presence couldn't pierce the heaviness. His hand on my shoulder was grounding, but my thoughts refused to settle. Images of Mark smiling, speaking, manipulating, the realization of his duplicity kept flashing in my mind like a relentless loop. I felt sickened by the ease with which he had used Amy, by the audacity of deceiving my mother, and by the staggering scale of control he had tried to assert over our lives. The man who had raised me, who claimed to care, had been orchestrating lies and seduction, and had placed my happiness and autonomy as something to be bargained with. Sleep eluded me. At night, I lay awake, listening to the hum of the city outside, thinking of all the missed signals, the subtle manipulations I had ignored or rationalized, and the naive trust I had placed in Mark. The realization of how much power he had wielded, even over my own family's perception, weighed heavily. I felt the isolation of knowing that while Julian and I were on the same side, my mother had been blind, and Amy, despite being a victim, was manipulated into complicity. At work, I struggled to focus. Each email, each meeting felt surreal. My mind kept drifting back to the evidence, the photos, the messages, the rehearsed lies Amy had delivered. The knowledge that Mark had groomed Amy over years, waiting for the precise moment to exploit her, churned in my stomach. Julian noticed my distraction, but even his reassurances felt distant, swallowed by the echoing gravity of everything that had occurred. The social repercussions hit next. Family gatherings became impossible to navigate. Friends who had admired Mark's composed exterior began questioning him. I could see the subtle judgment in the eyes of others, the whispered conversations, the glances. While part of me felt vindicated, another part felt exposed, vulnerable, and raw. The safety of my life, the predictability and trust I once felt, was shattered. There were moments when despair crept in, sneaking under the door of my resolve. I questioned my own judgment, wondering if I had missed signs, if I had been naive, if trusting my instincts had ever been enough. The image of Amy, tearful and manipulated, haunted me. The knowledge that Mark had tried to control, manipulate, and sabotage with precision left me feeling violated in a way that words cannot fully express. Even Julian, steadfast and rational, recognized the weight of the situation. Yet I felt the isolation of knowing that only we could navigate this storm. The consequences of Mark's actions would ripple through months, possibly years, of family dynamics. I could feel the pull of guilt and fear battling against the growing spark of empowerment. Could I expose him fully? Could I ensure my mother's safety, Julian's support, and my own autonomy without risking further manipulation or retaliation? In those dark hours, the truth became unbearably clear. Mark had weaponized trust, affection, and perceived authority to destabilize lives. I felt cornered by the enormity of the betrayal, the legal entanglements, and the emotional stakes. The feeling of being trapped, isolated in knowledge, unable to undo the past, was suffocating. Each attempt at planning the next step seemed dwarfed by the weight of what had already been done. Yet, in that darkness, a faint resolve flickered. Amid the guilt, despair, and shock, I recognized a growing awareness. While Mark had orchestrated chaos, he had underestimated one crucial thing: my ability to see clearly, to act decisively, and to reclaim control. I was not helpless. I was informed, supported, and capable. But before that clarity could fully emerge, I had to endure the bleakest point, the emotional nadir where fear, betrayal, and grief intertwined. For a long night, I sat alone, the house silent except for the soft ticking of a clock that seemed almost accusatory. My body was tense, my mind racing, and my heart heavy. The realization that life had irrevocably changed weighed on me like a lead blanket. Yet beneath the crushing despair, a whisper persisted. This is not the end. It's the point from which you will rise. The turning point didn't arrive with a shout or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, through evidence, witnesses, and the steady confirmation of truths I had long suspected but hadn't dared to face. After nights of despair and isolation, I finally saw the path forward, not one dictated by fear, guilt, or manipulation, but by clarity, justice, and resolve. It began with my mother, Linda. After I presented her with the photos, messages, and Amy's first-hand testimony, the color drained from her face. She had trusted Mark for 14 years, believed in his authority, his charm, his careful construction of the family narrative. Now, confronted with undeniable proof, she could no longer cling to denial. I watched as disbelief gave way to shock, and then, slowly, to resolve. She realized that the man she had built her life around had been systematically lying, cheating, and manipulating every relationship in his orbit. The fact that he had been grooming Amy, orchestrating lies, and attempting to sabotage my engagement left her reeling. But she also recognized that action was necessary. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. The fear and helplessness that had consumed me over the past weeks began to transform into a cold, steady determination. Julian, sitting beside me, radiated support. He didn't speak, but his presence was an anchor, a reminder that I wasn't navigating this alone. We were aligned, our purpose clear: protect ourselves, expose the truth, and prevent further harm. I reviewed every detail of the evidence again: timestamps, photos, messages, Amy's account. Each confirmation strengthened my resolve. There was no longer any room for doubt, no way for Mark to manipulate the narrative, no opportunity for him to argue ignorance. The weight of certainty settled over me like armor. For the first time, I understood that the situation was not endless chaos. It had boundaries, and those boundaries could be enforced. Then came the realization of responsibility. Julian reminded me gently, "Your mother deserves to know. She has the right to see the truth." I had known this, but fear had made me hesitant. The clarity of the moment forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth. Protecting Mark's secrets had been protecting him, not anyone else, and allowing the lies to continue would only perpetuate harm. I had to act decisively, now, not for vengeance, but for justice and the preservation of what remained intact in our lives. I approached the conversation with calm precision. I laid out the evidence for my mother, step by step, chronologically, objectively. No emotion-laden accusations, no dramatics, just facts. The photos, the messages, Amy's testimony, all there, undeniable. Watching her process it, witnessing her realization settle over her, was both heartbreaking and empowering. She had been deceived, but now she could reclaim her agency. I felt a surge of solidarity. She and I were no longer subjects of Mark's manipulation. We were actors with agency, clarity, and the power to change the course of events. It was at this juncture that Julian and I began to plan tangible next steps, protective orders, legal counsel, and strategies to ensure that Mark could not interfere with our lives or our future wedding became our focus. The fear of escalation remained, but it was now tempered by the understanding that we had a network of support, documentation, and moral authority. Mark's threats could no longer operate in shadows. They would face scrutiny, exposure, and consequences. Internally, I felt a profound shift. The despair, the isolation, the powerlessness that had dominated the past weeks was giving way to control, clarity, and a growing confidence in my own judgment. I realized that my life, my happiness, my engagement, my family, was no longer negotiable. Mark's manipulation had been extensive, but it was finite, and its exposure had dismantled the foundation of his control. For the first time since Amy's initial message, I allowed myself to breathe. The path was clear: protect those I loved, expose the truth, and reclaim the narrative of my life. I was no longer reacting. I was planning, acting, and reclaiming agency. And with Julian's unwavering support, I felt ready to confront the final stages of this ordeal. The turning point was not a single dramatic act. It was the alignment of evidence, support, and resolve, crystallizing into decisive action. I looked at Julian and whispered, "We can do this, together." His nod was all I needed. For the first time, I felt the weight of fear lift, replaced by purpose. Mark's control had ended. Our lives, though scarred, were ours to rebuild. The consequences of exposing Mark were swift, dramatic, and unavoidable. Once my mother, Linda, confronted him with the evidence, everything in his carefully constructed world began to unravel. The life he had meticulously curated, his reputation, his authority, his sense of untouchable control, crumbled in real time. He tried to argue, to charm, to twist the narrative, but the weight of indisputable proof was too heavy. The photos, messages, and Amy's testimony left no room for lies. Mark's first reaction was anger. He lashed out verbally, accusing me of betrayal, accusing Julian of manipulation, and claiming that he had been the victim of misunderstanding. But every accusation he hurled was met with counter-evidence, proof of his affair, his grooming of Amy, and the instructions he had given her to sabotage my engagement. Slowly, the people around him, the family members who had trusted his authority, the business associates who had admired his composure, began to doubt him. The foundation of control he had built over years began to collapse under scrutiny and the relentless force of truth. Linda, though initially devastated and hurt, reclaimed her agency. She demanded he leave their shared home, enforcing boundaries that he had consistently ignored. She involved her attorney, ensuring that any attempt to manipulate family assets or interfere with her decisions would be legally blocked. The realization that he had embezzled funds from her family trust added another layer of accountability. Mark's financial maneuvers, previously invisible due to trust and deception, now faced legal examination, further weakening his control and credibility. Amy, too, faced the fallout of her role, though she had been a pawn in Mark's game. The consequences were complicated. She was young, manipulated, and emotionally vulnerable, but her testimony became central in demonstrating the pattern of Mark's deception. The reckoning for her actions came as she had to navigate the reality of exposure and accountability, but it also illuminated the manipulative tactics Mark had employed over months, turning her compliance into evidence against him. For Julian and me, the fallout was intense but clarifying. We had to manage not only the emotional shock, but also the legal and social implications of Mark's exposure. Protective orders were filed, ensuring that Mark could not approach or harass us further. The engagement, once shadowed by fear and manipulation, became a symbol of resilience and truth. While the wedding planning required extra caution, every step we took was fortified by the knowledge that deception had been dismantled and that our decisions now rested on fact, not fear. The broader family dynamics shifted dramatically. Extended family members, previously neutral or unaware, began to take sides. Mark's allies dwindled as the evidence became undeniable. Linda's position, though initially fragile, solidified as she asserted control over the household and financial matters. Julian and I maintained transparency and integrity, which garnered support and trust from those who had been skeptical. Emotionally, the fallout was a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and residual fear. Witnessing Mark's loss of control and the exposure of his manipulations provided a sense of justice, yet the scars of betrayal remained. Julian and I leaned on each other, finding strength in our shared commitment and in the clarity that truth had provided. Linda's reclaiming of autonomy reinforced the lesson that deception, no matter how calculated, cannot withstand evidence and courage. By the end of the initial wave of fallout, Mark was isolated, legally restricted, and socially diminished. His attempts to maintain authority over anyone, me, Julian, or Linda, had failed. He faced legal consequences for harassment, financial misconduct, and the broader manipulative patterns he had employed. The person who had sought to control and dominate multiple lives now confronted the consequences of exposure and accountability. For Julian and me, the lesson was clear. Truth and evidence, combined with courage and support, dismantle manipulation. While the emotional and logistical challenges were immense, the clarity and resolution that followed marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which we could rebuild our lives, free from the shadows of deceit. The fallout, harsh and unrelenting, became the catalyst for freedom, empowerment, and the restoration of agency for everyone Mark had tried to control. Months have passed since the storm finally settled. The chaos, the betrayal, the threats, all of it has left scars, but it has also left clarity. Mark is no longer part of our lives. His manipulations have been dismantled, his influence nullified by evidence, courage, and the support of those he tried to control. My mother, Linda, has reclaimed her life with a newfound sense of autonomy and strength. Amy, once a pawn, is distant from the chaos, hopefully learning the weight of truth and the cost of manipulation. Julian and I, we're stronger than we ever were before. The engagement we thought might be tainted by interference became a testament to resilience. We married quietly, deliberately, surrounded by those who supported us and understood the truth. The ceremony was simple but profound, not about grandeur, but about love, trust, and the triumph of honesty over deceit. I've learned lessons that will stay with me forever. First, that manipulation can be subtle, extended over years, and hidden behind smiles and authority. But no deception can withstand truth when it is combined with courage and documentation. Second, that trust in oneself and in supportive allies is vital. Julian's calm presence and unwavering belief in me gave me the strength to confront lies that could have seemed insurmountable alone. Third, that confronting the truth, however painful, is always better than maintaining a fragile peace built on deception. The cost of silence is far greater than the discomfort of confrontation. Most importantly, I've learned that empowerment comes from acting decisively in the face of betrayal. Fear can paralyze, guilt can cloud judgment, but clarity, combined with action, restores agency. Standing up for myself, for Julian, and for my mother transformed a situation designed to control us into one that reasserted our autonomy and dignity. We're looking forward to the future now, carefully, deliberately, and with gratitude for the people and truths that remain steadfast. Life after trauma is not simple, but it is possible. Our wedding, our family, and our plans for a child remind me every day that love, honesty, and courage are more powerful than manipulation, fear, or control. The lesson is clear. When faced with deceit, document, confront, and reclaim your life. The world may try to dictate your narrative, but you have the power to write your own. And that is the story I share now, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that truth, resolve, and the support of loved ones can overcome even the most calculated attempts to undermine our lives.